Welcome to America's Talking. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. America's Talking is a production of America's Talking Network. You can go check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. Today, we have three great guests, once again, from the Center Square, discussing the Center Square Voters' Voice Poll. We cover about anything and everything in this poll, from the 2024 election, the 2020 rematch, cultural issues, issues with the news media, where the Center Square asked voters, asked taxpayers what they thought. And joining me today to talk about this is the Center Square's executive editor, Dan McCaleb. Dan, thanks for joining us again on America's Talking.
Cool. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
We also have the other half of the America in Focus podcast. It's the Center Square's Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief Casey Harper. Casey, welcome to America's Talking.
Also known as the better half, but thanks, Cole.
The better half. That's what I meant to say. We also have the Center Square's investigative reporter, Brett Rowland. Brett, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
As I mentioned, we'll be chatting about the Center Square's Voters' Voice poll today, and that is a set of polls that has covered a lot of different topics. Dan, I want to start with you on this. There are a lot of polls out there. You know, the polling has been around for a long, long time. It's been controversial for a long, long time. So I'll kind of start with a basic question. What is the purpose of the Center Square Voters' Voice poll? What is it? Why did the Center Square decide to go into the polling industry?
Well, Cole, thank you for starting with the true better half of the America in Focus podcast, just to set the record straight. But the most recent poll that we conducted was the fourth Center Square Voters' Voice poll since we launched it last year. There is a lot of interest nationwide. Voters, anybody really likes to gauge how they feel about a certain issue, of course, it's a presidential election year, about a certain candidate, and see where weigh themselves against others in the polling. So one, from a readership standpoint, we wanted to deliver our own poll. The other thing is, you know, there's obviously a lot of polling out there. And while we ask some very similar questions to some of those other national polls, for example, who do you prefer, Trump or Biden, et cetera? What do you feel about the direction of the country? Things like that. There wasn't a lot of diversity in the polling questions that are out there. So we wanted to focus on some of the issues that we know our readers care about and ask questions about things like energy policies that are dominating the country, education policies, particularly with the recent social issues that are involved in education right now. So we wanted to, one, gauge voters' interest in what it's a big presidential year and those kinds of topics, but also get more questions that just aren't being asked in these polls elsewhere.
And Dan, I'll stick with you real quick here. I mean, who are we talking to in these polls? I mean, what's the methodology behind this?
So we use Noble Predictive Insights, which is a nationally renowned polling company. And I should say also, too, that our poll is among the most extensive in the country. This past poll, which was conducted in March, we surveyed more than 2,500 voters, registered voters, likely voters, people at the beginning of the poll. And we start surveying these folks. We ask them, are you a registered voter? Are you a likely voter? What are your demographics? Male, female, things like that. And of those 2,500, it was actually 2,510 individual voters that we surveyed in March. 1,044 of them are Republicans. 1,126 of them are Democrats. So we try and get a diverse number of people to respond to these. And then 340 were true independents. So the very first part of the poll, if you participate, are those demographic questions. So we can make sure we get a balance of responses. So it's truly indicative of how the country feels about these topics that we ask them about.
And speaking about how the country feels, a lot of questions inside of this. And Brett, one of the, I would say, it may not be surprising, but I think it's fair to say the word alarming, is the majority of voters actually say the U.S. is heading in the wrong direction. And that was one of the takeaways from one of the Center Square Voters' Voice poll.
That's right. So a majority of voters did say that the country is heading in the wrong direction. But when you break those numbers down a little bit, it gets more interesting. So among likely voters, about 62% said things were moving in the right direction compared with 29 who said things were moving in the right direction, and about 9% were unsure. But when you look at Democrats and Republicans, it becomes clear that they are living in different realities, as David Byler of Noble Predictive Insights told us. Among Republicans, about 10% of likely voters said things were headed in the right direction. And among Democrats, 51% of likely voters said things were headed in the right direction. Now, if you gauge that against true independents, which we define in this poll as those who don't lead toward either party, 22% said things were going the right way compared to 65% who said things were going in the wrong direction. So there's really a lot of difference in opinion here.
And Casey, this is all happening with a presidential election year on the backdrop of this polling. So when you hear a majority of voters saying the U.S. is heading in the wrong direction, there was some polling that came out of the apparent rematch. There are some legal problems that former President Donald Trump is facing, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but of a rematch between Trump and Biden. And what did the poll say about that?
Yeah, I mean, so what we're seeing here, if you're in the Biden camp, of course, it could shoot off some alarm bells. It's not difficult to transpose how the country is doing generally with, hey, who's the incumbent? So, of course, this does give some fodder for Trump, the likely, the Republican frontrunner, to capitalize on this frustration to say, hey, the country is doing poorly. It's Biden's fault. I can turn things around. And I think that favors Trump generally because it allows him to kind of go back to his roots, which is I'm an outsider who's angry at the establishment. Aren't you angry too? And that worked really well in 2016 against an establishment candidate, Hillary Clinton. Now, of course, Biden is just as much an establishment candidate as Hillary was. He's a lifelong politician, but it is more difficult for Trump to make that argument because he served in the White House. He has his own baggage around January 6th, around indictments, around other things. But what he also has going for him, before I get into these numbers, is that, my assessment of this is that much of the frustration with the direction of the country is centered around Trump's key issue, and that is immigration. Illegal immigration has soared in the U.S. Since Biden took office. The border's in total crisis. Anytime you're on social media, you're seeing posts about it. You're seeing videos of whether you agree with calling it a caravan or not. Those are become a regular occurrence. You see these military-age men just pouring across the border, and even Democratic leaders, such as in Democratic cities like New York Mayor Eric Adams, has raised the alarm about immigration, making it a bipartisan issue. So why am I going into all that? It's I think that is one of the key reasons, alongside inflation, which voters I think largely do blame Biden for, since he's been in office so many years. You might have your own views on whether it's fair to blame him, but inflation, immigration, those issues are doing poorly. They've been going on for the entirety of Biden's administration. And it's one of the reasons that I think, back to the data, is that our poll found Trump beating Biden 46% to 45% with likely voters. So Trump is slightly ahead in our poll. That's within the margin of error. So you could call it a toss-up. But here's what's interesting, Cole. When you look at these third-party candidates and you allow voters to choose among, Trump, Biden, or maybe Jill Stein or RFK, some of these other third-party candidates, Trump's lead grows substantially. He gets a few points off of that. He goes up to 43% over Biden's 40%. RFK notably gets 7%, and then another 7% are not sure. The rest kind of trickles off to other third-party candidates. A couple takeaways of that is, one, if RFK stays in the race, it could be bad news for Biden. And the second point is that it suggests that this support for Biden is actually softer than it might appear, because as soon as voters are given an opportunity to not vote for Biden or Trump, they leave. But more Biden voters leave than Trump voters.
And to quote Brett Rowland's reporting on that, Casey, you mentioned inflation, immigration as top concerns ahead of the presidential election. Quote, likely voters are focused on inflation and price increases, illegal immigration, and the economy as incumbent President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump prepare for a rematch of the 2020 election in November. Brett, Casey kind of touched on that. What was the data behind what Americans are concerned about going into this election?
So Casey did a great job of queuing this up and pointing out, too, that the issues favor Trump over Biden. So when we first started doing this poll, illegal immigration was towards the middle of the pack. But as we keep asking about it, it's grown. So now it's almost neck and neck with inflation. So among the top three issues for likely voters, inflation was at 45%. Inflation and price increases were at 45%. Illegal immigration was at 44%. Economy and jobs down at 24%. Abortion rights, 22%. So these numbers have really ticked up, especially in terms of illegal immigration. That's really become an issue in this race. And that issue, as Casey pointed out, tends to favor Trump over Biden. Although, as we've seen before, polling can be unpredictable and it's not clear which way things will go yet. It definitely does seem like Trump has an advantage here.
And as you mentioned, a lot of time left until November. Dan, you were a seasoned journalist. You've covered many presidential election cycles. I think immigration is often thought about as a border state issue. Historically, middle America, the average voter, it's the economy, right? That's what we've heard for a long time in presidential elections. Immigration rising up. How do you read that?
Well, first, let me say I take offense to your calling me a seasoned veteran.
Yeah, how many seasons
I could have said old, but I went with seasoned. I thought that was a better.
Well, that's how I interpret it. So it certainly is no longer a border state issue. Obviously, Governor Greg Abbott, Texas governor, has the largest border with Mexico in the South, has been busing migrants to sanctuary cities across the country. Chicago, Illinois, which is where I'm at, has received almost 40,000 of those illegal immigrants bust from the border. New York City has gotten way more than that. As Casey mentioned, Mayor Eric Adams in New York City has called it a crisis there. And then there's Denver and Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles have also gotten it. But then you also have this significant issue with fentanyl, the fentanyl that's being smuggled across the southern border into the United States. And from there, it goes to communities everywhere. We've had the Montana governor, for example, saying that the fentanyl crisis is seriously impacting his state. And you've seen significant increases in fentanyl overdoses. It's not just fentanyl that we're talking about, other forms of meth, cocaine, etc. And then you've got the crime situation. We know some of these South and Central American countries, to make it easier on them, crime fighting, etc., they're some of the people who are crossing the border illegally and committing crimes, sometimes serious violent crimes in the U.S. So, and Americans are tuning in and they're paying attention and they're hearing about things that are going on in their communities when it comes to, these migrants. Now more than about 12 million have illegally crossed the border since President Biden took office. That includes a figure that only the Center Square reports, because that includes got-away data, those who aren't actually apprehended or coming through ports of entry, those who are successfully making it into the country that we know of because of video coverage, drone coverage. Agents have spotted them, weren't able to apprehend them. So if you add up the number of apprehensions, and of course, under President Biden, Border Patrol, for the most part, is releasing these migrants who illegally cross into the country, into the United States, with asylum hearings at some point in the future, in some cases for 5 years in the future. Well, those people are going to disappear. Many of those people are going to disappear in the country. And then you've got the gotaways who aren't apprehended at the border. So that's a big deal, and Americans are noticing.
You can check out all of these, the data points we're talking about here at thecentersquare.com. Again, this is the Voters' Voice poll. Before we move on from the election, there's one more poll I wanted to touch on. Brett, you wrote about one that came out of this research that shows Trump supporters plan to back him even if he's convicted of a felony. And this is a little bit unprecedented when it comes to a major party presidential candidate, but his supporters will stick with him, or so they say, if he's convicted.
So this one was a real interesting one. I think some other polling operations have asked this, but I think the way that we did it was pretty well done. So we asked voters who already indicated that they plan to support Donald Trump how they would respond to a conviction. So 84% of Trump voters said they would vote for him in November, even if he was convicted of a felony before the election. And all indications are that this is probably an undercount. The real number of people who would support him might be even higher than that. So The people that like Trump really like him. Now, there were some people who said that if he was convicted, they'd vote for a third-party candidate. That was about 5% of Trump supporters. 9% said they were unsure, which is a fairly decent number. And then 3%, which I found odd, would switch camps and vote for Biden if Trump were convicted. Now, this was the last of the 30 or so questions we asked, so I don't know if there's poll fatigue going on there, but there's certainly some interesting numbers. The other part of that is that most voters don't think he's going to be convicted. So about 35% of likely voters think that Trump will be convicted. Another 45% said he won't be convicted, and about 20% were unsure. So that adds some context to those numbers.
Yeah, a rematch election, but certainly not a rematch without its fair share of drama. Let's move on from the election talk here, gentlemen. One of the things that I think is underlying that, number about Trump's support, even if he's convicted, is increasing, lack of trust in, institutions. I'll put it that way, government institutions in particular. But Casey, you wrote a story which I thought was interesting on another major institution in the United States, which is the national news media. And the majority of likely voters do not trust news media. What do you take from that?
So, what do people think of the media? I think it's no secret that voters, Americans, are suspicious of the media for good reason. The media has gotten a lot of things wrong in recent years. I mean, the media was totally wrong on COVID, on a lot of things. They became very partisan and ran with very early data, scientific data on things like the vaccines and origins of the virus and the efficacy of lockdowns. And then later, in hindsight, we see that a more moderate response in many respects would have been wiser. So, that's one thing they got wrong. They were pretty much totally wrong on the Hunter Biden laptop. And now we have documents that show that they've had to basically retract their previous reporting. They mocked the Hunter Biden laptop as a conspiracy theory. And now we know the laptop is real. And some of the same outlets that said it wasn't real have later have reported on it as real and have totally had to backtrack. These aren't all political things, though. I mean, it's a common experience to turn on the TV and see much of the media is just shouting and arguing. And so anyway, there's a lot of things going into it. But what does our data say? What does the Center Square Voters Voice poll? Well, it's found that 43% of Americans say the media is trustworthy and 54% said it is not trustworthy. So clearly a majority say the media is not trustworthy. You see that younger voters trust the media a little bit more, whereas older voters trust the media less, right? It's interesting. One thing that's interesting is how would people define media? Another thing that's happened is our media has become, of course, it's online now. It's become much more siloed. You can get niche media that just speaks to exactly what you care about with the perspective you have. And so it'd be curious to see if maybe younger voters have a better access to that, and that's why they trust the media more. But that is mostly speculating. So, like I said, there's this other issues, Cole, that the media's gotten wrong. COVID was a big one. I think a lot of people were upset with how the coverage of the post George Floyd riots and how that went. And then, of course, the media told us over and over and over that Donald Trump had no chance of being president. And then he won somehow. And of course, pretty much everyone was wrong about that on the right and the left. But, you can't get so many things wrong and people start to say, well, the media is helpful, but I just don't trust them as much as I used to.
And Dan, don't hate me for this. I'm going to go back to that seasoned word. As a seasoned journalist, Dan, you've been in the news media industry for a while, right? Enough to see some of these trends shift in the trust of media outlets. I mean, how do you see that difference over the years of where the state of media is now and really the trust in media versus, decades ago?
Well, the media and, of course, technology has changed so much over the many seasons, as you like to point out, Cole, that I've been in the media myself. When I first got to age myself for Cole's benefit here, when I first got into the media, into journalism, into the news world, there was no social media. Twitter didn't exist. Facebook didn't exist, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, there was still, honestly, when I got into the news media, CNN and Fox News. Maybe I shouldn't go there. That's going to age me too much. People read newspapers, things like that. But, then the CNNs of the world, the Fox News of the world got on during prime time when people aren't working and have time to watch regular TV. It's not news. It's talking heads yelling at each other, going back and forth. Nowadays, it's not even yelling at each other. It's one side spewing their side's talking points and the other side spewing their side's talking points. And, Casey just gave a number of recent examples of the media getting major stories wrong. And I'll be honest with you, it's mostly the left-leaning media that's gotten these stories wrong, such as the Hunter Biden laptop. And then you had all kinds of suppression of alternative opinions when it came to COVID. Many of those alternative opinions turned out to be right. So it's no wonder that, the last 10, 15 years or so, trust in media has waned. And I'm just not surprised by it.
Dan, do you think this is a phenomena that's a little bit like, you hear these stories of everybody hates Congress, but they love their congressman type thing? I mean, is this a similar sort of thing when it comes to news media?
You're right about that. And the same could be said. I think one of the questions we asked in our poll was, what do you think about your local economy versus the national economy? And how do you feel about your local school as compared to education across the country? And more people said they think their local economy is fine. They think their local school is fine. But what they see in the media nationwide, the national economy is not good and the national education is not good. So yes, there's certainly some of that. But, obviously we're deluged with news coverage, media coverage. There's so many 24/7 TV news channels now. Twitter is 24/7. Facebook is 24/7. And when it comes to social media too, but it's not just social media, because we've talked about the examples on mainstream media coming from quote unquote professional journalists. There's a lot of disinformation out there. So yes, there are similarities to what you just asked, Cole, but I think this is a little bit different too than that.
And Casey, I'm going to kick this over to you for a sec. I think there is, when it comes to the news media, but really when you mentioned in your story, institutions in general, there is a Washington D.C. bubble, and you know what I mean when I say that, Casey. I mean there is a Washington D.C. class of people. How big do you see that disconnect between the average taxpayer going about their life versus how that average D.C. community member, I'll put it that way, this is really part of a political class. Is that part of this disconnect, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely true that there's a big difference. The difference in lived reality, lived experience, the real estate's different, the commutes are different, the politics are different. I mean, people may forget that D.C. went 94% for Hillary Clinton. Now, it's not surprising that a big city would go for Hillary Clinton. Most of them did, but 94% shows a kind of bias or difference that is just so far off from the rest of the country. The rest of the country was 50-50.
Yeah, so we're recording this on April 10th. Just this week, a top editor at National Public Radio, where many people get their news, came out and essentially criticized his own company, accused his own company of progressive bias since Trump was elected, since the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis that Casey referenced earlier. Said they went from what he considered to be maybe a slight tick left of center in their coverage to way off the rails left when it come to hiring. He counted editors at National Public Radio, and I don't have the number exactly in front of me, but something like more than 70 editors on staff at National Public Radio were registered Democrats, and they had exactly 0 registered Republicans. They started these initiatives that essentially activist journalism that skewed way left progressive. When people hear that, when people read about that, yeah, your trust in the media is going to plummet.
Yeah, and Dan, I'm going to stick with you. We're kind of running short on time here. Casey mentioned earlier COVID-19 being a turning point on some of these things. And I think one of the biggest, topics that came under the microscope in 2020, 2021 was the topic of education. And the Center Square's Voters' Voice poll, it covered a decent amount of talk on education. What did participants say when it came to education and really the state of education in America in 2024?
Well, we asked a few different questions on education in this latest poll, and the responses to those questions, one story that we got out of it was a sort of unique story, is that education, used to be an issue that Democrats dominated. Voters, readers, individuals trusted Democrats more on education than Republicans. But because of COVID, let's face it, blue states kept schools closed much longer than red states. We've seen the impact of the learning loss from those school closures. There was a big difference, of course, between Trump's COVID policies and Biden's COVID policies. You had vaccine mandates. In blue states, you had vaccine mandates to even go into a restaurant in some cases. So anyway, going back to schools, what an analysis of our polling numbers on education found was that Republicans have closed the gap when it comes to being a trust issue with voters. More voters trust Republicans, or I shouldn't say more voters trust Republicans and Democrats than the issue. What used to be a pretty big gap has tightened to almost nothing. So Republicans have gained ground on the education issues, and it's not just COVID, oh, that's a part of it. It has to do with these social issues that are popping up in schools now. Some blue states have passed these laws where teachers are not allowed to inform parents if a student comes to them and says, hey, I want to be called by a different name and be categorized as a different gender than my birth gender. So it's a parental rights issue when it comes to that. Of course, critical race theory has been a big issue in the last few years. Larger percentages of our students can't read and write at grade level, but many schools across the country are putting a big emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues as opposed to the basics, reading, writing, math, science, geography, history, things like that. And our survey found the majority of parents think schools should stick to the basics.
And gentlemen, we're going to wrap it up there. There is so much information. It's a gold mine inside of the Center Square Voters Voice poll. You can read more about this at thecentersquare.com, and you can read the stories from Dan, Brett, and Casey there as well. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I'll do a plug for their podcast. Dan and Casey co-host America in Focus every week, which is the Center Square's national news podcast. So you can check that out as well. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I want to thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to hit that subscribe button and check out all of our other great podcasts at americastalking.com. We will catch you back next time on America's Talking.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life. Add value